first episode of One-on-One with Rich Pierce. Thank you so much for joining me. Oddly enough, today will actually be a one-on-two. I'm joined by two former Ohio lawmakers, Democrat Lou Gentile, formerly a state senator representing the 30th District, and Andy Thompson, former state representative from the 95th District. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. Happy to have you. It's our very first episode here today, so thanks for being here, both of you. And I did flip a coin earlier to see who would talk first. I know you're not running against each other. This isn't a formal debate or anything like that, and it's not because we dressed alike, Lou, but you did win the debate.
It's the inaugural.
Did win the coin flip there. Okay. Yeah, it is the inaugural. So you'll answer the first question tonight, and obviously we're going to be talking about this topic for a long time. It's a pretty heated one. A lot of folks upset about it. Drivers we've spoken with. It's the potential gas tax. Governor Mike DeWine, he wants 18 cents a gallon. The Ohio State House says you can have 10.7 and you can have it over 2 years. So, Lou, what do you think?
Well, I think it's important to know sort of where we're coming from over the last 8 years for really to get some context around this discussion, because over the last 8-year period, the state of Ohio has cut taxes, has floated bonds or issued bonds and debt, took on a lot of debt for road improvements. And so this is something that I think the governor felt like was needed, and the legislature, both parties, actually agreed with him. There's an interesting thing that happened several months ago with the leadership in Columbus, especially in the Ohio House of Representatives. I think it's important to understand that we have now a bipartisan coalition of Democrats and Republicans that have supported Speaker Householder. And that coalition, this was sort of the first test of that coalition, and it seemed to hold pretty good. It was an overwhelming vote in the Ohio House. So while no one ever likes new taxes and tax increases, I think there are some things that Democrats can point to out of this legislation that will be good for communities like Eastern Ohio. If you take a close look at what was in the bill, it's going to increase money for local spending. Governor DeWine wanted 40% of those tax revenues to come back for local bridges and roads, and now 45% of that's going to come back locally. There was a big victory for people who care about public transit, like transit, over $100 million now for public transit. So, you know, I was proud to say I voted against the leasing of the Turnpike at the time. I didn't think we should take on that debt. But now we have a real serious issue with our roadways, and there was some major compromise that took place in the Ohio House between both parties, and the Speaker advancing his agenda and working with Democrats to do that. So it should be interesting to see what happens in the Senate. I feel like the Senate's been kind of cool to the notion of increasing taxes, so it'd be really interesting to see what happens once it gets over to the Senate.
Andy, what do you think?
Senate President Larry Obhoff has sent a signal that he is not very favorable toward this idea of increasing taxes, certainly not without some kind of offset. I saw a letter that was released by Grover Norquist of Americans for Tax Reform calling on the House and Senate of the Ohio legislature to really consider some kind of offset so that it isn't a net tax increase. I have a source in the Senate, which I won't name, but somebody who's a good friend of mine, and this senator has said that the tax will probably come out of the final package, and that it will be more of something that they will consider in the overall budget, because you'll have more offsets there with which to kind of horse trade. But I think it is, as Lou said, it's been a different kind of thing in the Ohio House. We had an interim speaker. I was a candidate for that office, and I'm a failed candidate for that office. But this was a real different outcome when we elected the speaker this year, in that, you know, virtually half of his votes came from the Democrat side. So it was really, again, he reached out to that side. He needed those votes in order to become the speaker. And with that, a coalition was launched. And I will say this, Jack Serra, who's known here locally, is quite close with Speaker Householder, and that's probably something that's really benefiting the folks of the Channel 9 viewing area. There was a strong vote in favor of the transportation budget, but there were 27 no votes, too. Ironically, many of them who are householder people. So it's an interesting to see what happened here. If the Senate does not concur, if the Senate does take action against it, then you're going to have a bunch of people who voted for a tax increase without help from their colleagues in the Senate, and that's never a good thing to be in that position.
Now, Governor DeWine, when he proposed the 18%, he was saying it would generate $1.2 billion annually, and that would go toward fixing roads, bridges. Gentlemen, where else is that money going to come from? If it doesn't come from this tax, or if it's at 10.7 cents over 2 years. Andy, we'll start with you.
Well, part of the money they're proposing will come from the Oil and Gas Fund, and that's money that's going to be going back to the affected areas. During my time in the legislature, I was very concerned about a move to do such a thing because politicians in other states have shown that once they get their fingers in that cookie jar, it becomes a slippery slope. The oil and gas money is collected. It's to go toward regulatory oversight and then also to help with the orphan wells. And we just passed a bill that I had carried last session that won overwhelming support and now is helping us deal with the orphan wells, which are a real threat to our groundwater. So, the argument is there's excess money there. If it's over $50 million in the fund, we will tap into that for local infrastructure. I think it's something that's worthy of discussion. But even though I am a recovering politician, sometimes when politicians have a source of money like that, and if it's not limited to infrastructure, then it becomes a general fund kind of bailout. And so I'm a little concerned about that slippery slope.
Luke? Well, and Representative Serra was instrumental in trying to get some of that severance money put back into this area, and he was successful in this transportation at directing that money at roads and bridges for Eastern Ohio, and that's something that politicians in Eastern Ohio have been trying to do for a long time. It's been a real struggle. I think it's important to remember the last 8 years during the Kasich administration where really there was very little, if any, bipartisan cooperation like you've seen in the House as of right now. And there was an approach to taking on more debt, like with the Turnpike or cutting taxes. And I think you're hearing more from this governor that's very different in terms of investing in communities and having sort of that traditional partnership with local governments that we've sort of not seen over the past 8 years. And this transportation budget and this coalition held up. And, there are facets of organized labor in the state of Ohio that support this transportation budget because they know it'll bring jobs, it'll create jobs, it'll put people out building the roads and bridges. So that's an important aspect of it. Certainly you have to be sensitive to folks who are on the lower economic scale and how are they going to afford an increase in taxes. But you always have to balance that, and that's why there's the process. That's why there's a legislative process. The House obviously didn't go for the full 18-cent increase, which is what Governor DeWine was promoting. But I think to my friend Andy's point, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the Senate because from everything I've read, this President Obhoff has been very cool to this notion of raising taxes without cutting other taxes. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. This is a long process, Rich. It's not just what one body passes. It's got to go to the Senate. There's got to be a bill that gets worked out in the end. And
whether it's 40%, whether it's 45%, if this does, in the end pass, going to local governments, is that enough? I mean, that's the concern that we're hearing from folks. They're saying, oh, yeah, well, this will go to the 3 Cs. And it won't go anywhere else. What do you think? You think it's legitimate?
Yeah, that's my concern. That was my concern. Once you tap into this, it goes to Columbus, but is that a one-way journey? And that's why I always cautioned Lou when he was in the Senate and also Jack Serra, because all of a sudden Southeast Ohio has something positive going on, and Columbus can't wait to get its hands on those revenues. We are an economic driver for this for our state. We see more economic activity coming in the form of a cracker plan if we get that. We have the best place in the world to do business when it comes to shale gas and putting that into plastics. So we really have an advantage here. And I like to see that. I like that Governor DeWine is paying attention to Appalachia because a lot of times politicians promise things to Appalachia and then you don't hear from them until it's re-election time. So that is encouraging that he's listening to Appalachia. I think we're going to be generating a lot of economic activity for Ohio, so that should be respected. And if the money stays here, my hope was always that the money didn't go to Columbus, that it would stay here and get invested and provide more broad-based opportunity to go into foundations, go into other places where it can get right to work here in Appalachia. So what you point out there is a concern for me. I hope that the money stays here and make sure that we maximize this opportunity for the people of our region.
Luke? Well, I think it's important that you think about job creation and economic growth, but also marry that with the need for solid transportation infrastructure, roads and bridges. And so, it's going to be the job of those who are in office to advocate on behalf of those revenues coming back to our part of Ohio. I think it's a good step what Representative Serra has done with the transportation budget to redirect some of that money. I think it's like $10 million over a 2-year period. He should be commended for that. He's worked on that for a long time. But also, going forward, being able to attract businesses and an economic development climate is going to be contingent upon our ability to have solid infrastructure, roads and bridges. And so that's the balance here, is how do you make sure that we're adequately keeping up pace with the needs for our roads and our bridges across Ohio, in particular this region, which, you know, I think we're on the cusp of a real economic resurgence. When you look around the area, you see the possibility of 2 ethane cracker plants situated between Ohio, you know, right between eastern Ohio and western PA. And down in Belmont County, you see now 3 natural gas-fired power plants that are going to be coming online in this region. Of course, JSW Steel. So there's a lot of activity happening, and that needs to be married with adequate investment in our basic infrastructure, our roads, our bridges.
All right, gentlemen, stay right where you are. We are going to go to a commercial break. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. This is One on One with Rich Pierce.
Dream Vacations, tuition, debt, home and